Okay, we might get started. I think everybody's ready to go. Ernest is ready to go. So let's kick this off. Hi everybody, I'm Craig Crossland. I've been lurking in the background for the last couple of sessions, which Chris has been managing ably. It's my turn to get very briefly in front of the camera. So I'd like to welcome you all to the Hot Topics session of the R&D Doctoral Consortium. So we're going to have a little bit of a different format today. The last couple of weeks it's been an hour and a half on one topic. Today we're going to do about 3 hours in total, but on 3 different topics. So we first have our micro topic, which is our best practices versus actual practices. And that's Ernest Boyle from Iowa. Then we'll have our macro topic, which is the big E, endogeneity, with Mike Withers from Texas A&M. And then we have our qualitative topic, which is video analysis with Ann Smith from Tennessee. We will aim for about 50 minutes for each of the 3 topics. We'll go from 2 to 2:50 for the first, 3 to 3:50, and then 4:10 to 5. We've got to start that one a little late because Ann will be traveling to get here. So I think for each of the presenters, they're aiming to go for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions after that. All right, let me start by introducing Ernest Boyle. So Ernest is an associate professor at the Tippie College of Business at the University of Iowa. Ernest's expertise is in research methods primarily. He studies questionable research practices, outcome reporting biases, publication biases. So if you're dodgy, Ernest is going to catch you. He also studies dark personality traits and superstar effects. I wanted to make one other small point, seeing as this is the R&D consortium. Last year, Ernest won one of the highest awards in the R&D, which is the Early Career Award, which is a great achievement. So you are in great hands, and as you will see, he is repping CARMA as well. All right, I'll leave you over to Ernest.
Turn my mic on, and hopefully there's no echo at this point. Thank you very much, Craig, for the introduction. It's very nice. I am really excited to talk about this, and I'm really grateful that you're all here to discuss this, what I consider a pretty important topic. And since I really do want to get to your feedback and your discussion as much as possible, I'm just going to dive right in and talk about this topic of best practices versus actual. And before we even get started, just to clarify, this is not best practices and how to do science. There's no right way or wrong way to do the research that I'm going to tell you about. So if you're qualitative, you're quantitative, you're into experiments or you're Bayesian, all of that is your prerogative, and you should pursue your research as you see fit. That's really one of the best parts about being a researcher, in my opinion, is autonomy. On the other hand, when it comes to reporting that research in whatever form it is, when it comes to reporting it, I do think that we can paint with a pretty broad brush. And we could say there's the right way to do it and there's the wrong way to do it. And my definition when it comes to this idea of best reporting practices, because remember, it's not best science, best practices and how to do it. It's best practices and how to research or report it. It's a pretty simple definition for me. If it is likely to meaningfully affect a reasonable person's perception, then it should be reported. Now, there's wiggle room there. Like what's a reasonable person, or what's a likely amount that it's going to affect it. But my definition of a reasonable person would really be anybody educating the field. So this is a reviewer, this is an editor, a reader. And for somebody that is in many of your positions, which is trying to decide a dissertation topic, imagine if you're reading that article, what information that was either not reported or perhaps misreported, if any of that misreported or unreported information would have affected your decision to pursue that as a dissertation topic, I would imagine that's information you would have wanted to have. So, for example, would a reasonable person would want to know that the response rate that I reported, I said it's 80%, but I neglected to tell you that I had this initial screening where maybe only 5% of the people actually said, sure, I'll take your survey, and of that 5%, 80% agreed. Or if I dropped that data in excess of 3 standard deviations and said I did that, but I neglected to mention that I only did it to the right of the me, or I only did it in my control group. One that's been on the message boards a lot lately is this idea of the topic of parking, which is hypothesizing after results are known. So if I detect a three-way interaction, going through my data, which is something I think we all do, we all explore our data, there's nothing wrong with that. But once I detect that through exploration, I then go back and build a hypothesis around that. Is that information that you would want to know, as opposed to me potentially misreporting it, saying I plan to test this hypothesis from the get-go. I expected this three-way interaction to be there. And finally, I think a really common one, especially in the situation many of you find yourselves into in the dissertation process, you start with a whole lot of hypotheses, but once the analyses begin to be run and once the manuscript is written up for publication, perhaps a lot of the hypotheses disappear, which is fine. It's a big document. You expect it to be trimmed down. But if the hypotheses that are being dropped tend to be those that aren't statistically significant or supported, to be more broadly thought about it. If it tends to be the only thing that actually gets submitted is the supported hypotheses, that can give somebody the false impression that perhaps the theory is a little more robust than maybe the results initially suggested. So that's really all I have about best reporting practices. Like that one sentence and those few examples, kind of, all right, that's the best reporting practices, because what I typically see and what I've a lot of research with a lot of great colleagues recently has been on the issue of actual reporting practices, and to the extent to which they diverge from best practices, to the extent that there's a motivation to engage in non-ideal reporting, and then trying to figure out things that you and I can do to move us towards best practices. And I'm saying you and I'm a junior faculty member, and if you're a doctoral student right now, we don't have really the ability to large sway over the editorial process. We can't just start JAP's editorial policy is going to change. We don't have that power, but we do have a lot of power in our own research, and we do have a lot of power when we're serving as reviewers. Now, when I talk about these what I perceive as non-ideal reporting practices, I want to avoid the discussion of outright fraud. So if you've heard of a guy named Diederik Stapel before, he was this social psychologist. He just outright made up his data. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about researcher degrees of freedom and what effect these little the gray areas in terms of reporting and misreporting, the gray areas there that in the aggregate can have a pretty profound effect. And that's what I'll show you a few examples of what I mean by that. And by the way, I'm going to rely a bit on some of my own research. I'm just doing that because I have those data handy, and it's also focused exclusively on management and applied psychology. However, there's some other recent work coming out that I'll reference as well. But if you wanted to look at the more established work in this area, you can go to the medical literature and social psych literature, and I put some of those on the suggested list. So this is one paper that I worked with George Banks and Eric Gonzalez-Moulet on. And what we did, probably pretty germane to this group, we tracked dissertations to journal publications. And in some, we found about 2,300 and change hypotheses. Of that, 645 were both in the dissertation as well as the publication, so they were common or retained. About 300 and change were added, which means they had already proposed, collected the data, and defended their dissertation and published the dissertation. It's copyrighted, so it's a publication. And then when it actually went to the journal, new hypotheses were there that were never in the dissertation. And then there was about 1,300 hypotheses that were dropped. So they only appeared in the dissertation. We looked at a lot of these researcher degrees of freedom, and I won't go through all of them, because basically it boils down to changes were made to the data or changes were made to the hypotheses. And what we found was a pretty substantial swing in terms of statistical support, whereas in the hypotheses, less than half, 45%, were statistically significant or supported. Once it made it to the journal articles, 2 out of 3 were, 66% more. And what that represents is more than doubling of the ratio of supported to unsupported hypotheses. So I say that because all of these are driven by those small decisions to either misreport or not report something. And I think at the end of the day, when we look at it in the aggregate, it's not a bad apple issue, it's a bad barrel one. It's one where the system has kind of put a lot of pressure on people to present work in this way. But the challenge that we face, even though these aren't considered, I think Art Bedeen used the word cardinal sins, in the aggregate, you can see it has a pretty substantial effect. And if you were trying to base a dissertation on some of this work that came out of these dissertations, you might be thinking that, oh, there's a lot of empirical support for it, when in fact that may not be the case. I really like this Bosco et al. Paper that appeared in Personnel Psychology, JAP last year. And they looked at 9 different relationships to job performance. They also reanalyzed a meta-analysis, and they found this really strange behavior that happens whenever something is hypothesized. If it's hypothesized, its effect size is larger than when it's not hypothesized. And there's really no reason for that. There's nothing special about being hypothesized, and they've ruled out a lot of different things that could have caused that. But at the end of the day, the only thing that they figured that could have had that sort of effect was what amounts to p-hacking, or non-ideal changes to a manuscript either before the submit or as it goes through the revision process. And we can talk a little more about p-hacking in just one second, because this is a paper that was presented last year at Academy, and right now it's under review. And it's on a topic called moderated multiple regression. Most of you are probably familiar with this. MMR interactions are really common, and MMR is the most common way to test it. We were just trying to establish benchmarks so people could figure out about the sample sizes they needed to recruit to detect a typical effect size with a moderated multiple regression equation. But when we got into the data, we noticed that really strange behavior that you see there, which is this rapid rise in statistical significance, going from 42% in the late 90s to 52% to 62% to 72%. And if you actually look at the simulation work on MMR, we shouldn't be coming anywhere close to those levels of statistical support, because our sample sizes are small and MMR effect sizes are really small. And we just can't figure out why you would see this 30% swing in statistical significance over such a short time frame, especially when you consider that mean sample sizes have actually decreased over that same 20-year window. And on that same project, when we looked at the distribution of p-values around the 0.05 threshold, if you look at where those sit, it should be a uniform distribution. So if there's high evidentiary value, you'll kind of see this, doing it wrong, you'll kind of see this peak that then drops down, but it's always a smooth curve, either a flat curve or a smooth one. There's no statistical reason to have a spike at 0.049, but of course that's exactly what we found, and that tends to suggest the practice I mentioned before, p-hacking. Basically what happens is a researcher might initially get a p-value of 0.07, and after tinkering with the data a little bit, either removing a couple outliers or what become outliers, or perhaps subbing a control variable in and out, what they'll figure out is that they're able to get their p-value down below 0.05. And if so, it's statistically significant, and the perception is that reviewers are going to be more amenable to the idea that, hey, look, it's statistically significant, therefore I'm right. We also found another strange practice in the same data set, or a strange effect in the same data set, which was the correlation between effect size and sample size. It really should be zero. Sampling error is randomly distributed, so the relationship to anything that's randomly distributed should be zero. But we find this really big negative 0.33 correlation. And what that means is as sample size drops, effect size increases. And we can't figure out anything that goes with that or that explains that, other than, or we have some alternative explanations there, but the one that we feel is the most likely one is that perhaps a lot of interactions are being tested, but only a few of them are being reported, and it just so happens those are the few that tend to be statistically significant, which means those are the few that have the largest effect sizes, and that would explain a negative relation there. I'm going to keep moving here. And I don't mean to just bombard you with these spots, but I do think it's important to kind of get an idea of the scope of it before we talk about potentially ways to fix it. This is a great paper by Green and colleagues. I'm hoping that this will be in press pretty soon here. They actually looked at structural equation models and tried to figure out the degrees of freedom based on the figures, so something like you see on that typical mediation model in SEM. And they found that when they went back and actually tried to calculate the degrees of freedom, 40% of them didn't match. And for a large percentage of that group, for the 2 out of 5 that don't match, a large percentage were off only by a couple of degrees of freedom. And what that likely means is that if you've ever run modification indices in a structural equation model, it will sometimes recommend, hey, if you set this path free between the error terms of 2 indicators, you can drop your chi-square by 60 points or something like that. Well, that's not a theory-driven decision. That's a very sample-specific decision that just so happens to get the CFI to the right place or the chi-square to the right place. Unfortunately, though, that's not recorded. It's never mentioned that those paths are free, and that's the reason why you don't see the freedom match. This is something that is just started working on a couple weeks ago, or I just started really talking about how to present this a couple weeks ago. But Larry Williams, Joya Wu, who's at University of Iowa with me, we started looking at SEM models that reported, SE models that reported the RMSEA. We took what they reported, and then we recalculated it based on the sample size, the chi-square, and the degrees of freedom. The distribution should be roughly the same. But if you look at what the distribution is, it's nowhere near. So on the left side here, it's the recalculated RMSEA. It looks the way it should look, a pretty normal distribution. No real peaks or valleys to it. But if you look on the right side, you do see those peaks and valleys, and it shouldn't come as that big of a surprise. Where the peaks and valleys are right around the 0.08 and right around 0.05, which are traditional thresholds for adequate and good fit when it comes to the RMSEA. Again, further indicating that there's been some tinkering there. And sometimes the tinkering is quite egregious. And sorry, I got cut a little bit on the bottom there. We actually went in and found some, and I deliberately kind of rounded off numbers because it's not a bad apple issue. It's not a few single people doing bad things. I think it's a system pressure issue, so I don't want it to ever identify people. But, 3 very recent examples, AMJ, JOM, and JAP. In all 3 cases, the recalculated RMSEA was more than double the reported RMSEA. We think in these cases, it wasn't even an issue of tinkering with the data. It was just outright, that's not a good RMSEA, therefore I'm going to report an RMSEA that's much lower. That is acceptable. It's not even a 0.05 or an RMSEA, it's not a threshold issue is what I'm saying. This is response rates for workplace deviance studies. And we don't really have hard and fast rules about what a good response rate or a bad response rate is. The white circles are observed response rates. The black circles are studies that probably exist, but the response rate was withheld from it. And again, it appears to be that when response rate is low, its likelihood of being reported is far lower than when the response rate is good, so to speak. So why are we seeing these things? So kind of use the last few minutes here to talk about why isn't the field engaged in best practices? And this is something I've talked to people about ad nauseum. And when I had this discussion with George Banks, he decided to approach it in a really systematic way. He surveyed, I think he sent out something like 3,000 invitations to people to fill out some survey information about questionable research practices and researcher degrees of freedom. But then he also had this open-ended response section. This was fascinating. Now, I cherry-picked these 3, so this is not representative of the group. But these three perspectives here, this tended to be what when people said this isn't much of an issue, or I'm going to keep doing research the way that I've always done it, it tends to be from one of these 3 camps. Either this first one, which is, these aren't even bad practices. You can hypothesize after results are known. You're allowed to, manipulate the data until eventually you get significant results. It's the only thing that you're not allowed to do is fabricate data. The second perspective is I recognize that this is problematic, but I don't want my mortgage check to bounce because I got a p-value of 0.06. In other words, the perception is unless I do these sorts of things, unless I'm willing to make these small researcher degrees of freedom changes, then I'm not going to get published. I mean, we know that publications that's the coin of the realm. If you don't publish, you don't get placed, you don't get tenured, you don't get all the baubles that come with being a quote unquote successful academic. So even though it's bad, I feel obligated to do it. The final one is a really cynical perspective, and thankfully it was less than 5% of people expressed this opinion, is that yes, these practices would be bad if we were a science, but we're not a science. Rather, we're kind of like the legal profession. A lawyer's job, a defense attorney's job, is not to present the truth. It's to present the most plausible case that's going to convince a jury to say not guilty. And we should treat our research the same way, which is our job is to present the most plausible case for these data, or to present a theory and then figure out ways to make the data support the theory as best as possible. Collectively, I think this is the reason why we're seeing a lot of what has become known as questionable reporting practices or research degrees of freedom. And in closing, I wanted to end on something, things that we could do besides just bemoan it. And you can look at some of my own publications included, and you kind of get to the discussion section after finding a lot of these problems, and it's all about, well, this is really bad, and there's not a lot of solutions presented outside of people that are at the highest echelons. This is what editors need to do. This is what the Academy of Management needs. I think that we should spend a lot more time talking about what we, individuals like you and I, can do, which is protect ourselves as best as possible when we're setting up our research so we're not faced with these tough decisions, so that we're less likely to end up with being forced to drop poor hypotheses. So how do we do that? It's pretty simple, right? It's a lot of rigor that goes into the methodology and the analysis, and then a lot of thought that goes into the theory development and hypothesis development, assuming you're coming from a hypothetical deductive model. So really digging into the literature, read it with a critical eye, and don't judge the veracity of a conclusion based on its outlet. There's a lot of good papers in what are seen as not great outlets, and there's a lot of pretty bad papers and what are the highest outlets out there. So, and one of the closing points here for our own research, if you are using NHST, then you want to make sure you have adequate statistical power. That does mean the power analysis based on each hypothesis. So oftentimes, I see this when somebody's proposing a dissertation, for example, they'll say, I'm looking at a medium effect size, and by Cohen standards, this is going to mean I need a sample size of 200. Well, for a correlation, that's correct. But if the hypothesis is a three-way interaction, then that's not correct. It shouldn't be looking for, that's not enough statistical power. So more thought into exactly what is the sample size requirement for each hypothesis. And if it turns out it's too much, a three-way interaction that causes levels of analysis and is fully mediated by some other fourth variable, maybe to just say, it's a great idea for future research. Unfortunately, I don't have 1,500 people, therefore I'm not going to probe that interaction. The other thing that we do have control over as junior faculty folk and as doctoral students is most of you have probably already been asked to review for conferences, and many of you have probably been asked to review for journals. When reviewing other people's research, don't encourage them to engage in questionable research practices or researcher degrees of freedom. Critically evaluate the introduction and methods, because that's where the rigor and relevance lies. It's almost treating it as a dissertation proposal, which people like Steve Roberberg already have this at Journal of Business and Psychology. You can send them an intro and method section and say, I would like to pursue this topic. If I execute this method, would you be willing to publish it regardless of what the results are? That's a very interesting way to move in the field, and I really like it. And then the last thing here, ensuring the tests, or the last couple things here, ensuring the tests are accurately conducted and reported. That does mean occasionally breaking out the Cohen and Cohen textbooks or going to a t-test calculator and saying, wow, you know, you report this mean and standard deviation, you report a t-test that's significant. I'm not getting the same numbers as you are getting. What's going on here? And finally, it's okay to query the authors to check assumptions and data. And if this has happened recently to you, that a reviewer has asked you to take your data and put it into graphicaldescriptors.org, I'm sorry for breaking the blind review process, but it was probably me. And I'm asking most of the papers that are reviewing these days to do this. This is Louis Tay and James LeBreton's new web app, and it's just great. They take a comma delimited file, they drag and drop it directly into this Shiny app, and this is what it gives them. It allows you as the reviewer to really see what's going on in the data at the univariate and bivariate level, and it's far more informative than a correlation matrix. From this, a lot of times I can start to look at their data and say, so, you know, something's going on here, perhaps, you know, we're getting a little in front of the data, so to speak. So with that, and sorry, I am a fast talker and I've had like 5 cups of coffee. With that, it's now 2:27, so I'll go ahead and stop talking now and turn it over to you for discussion. And thank you very much for your time. Why those questions are being typed, there is that one last slide here. Here's some of the work I was drawing from. You'll see it's a little oil heavy, sorry, but I think that's going to change the next couple of years. I think this is going to be a much broader topic with a lot of involved, not that there are already a lot of people. Chris, you just asked the difference between dominance analysis and relative weight analysis. I don't know. I tend to just use the relative weight analysis that is from I think it's the Brett piece in ORM. I'm sorry, I don't have a lot more insight than that. Okay, Mohammed, that particular piece, and I'll go back to that slide. Yeah, I kind of zoomed right through that, didn't I? What you see here is the white cert observed response rates. Now they've been converted into the logit, so the numbers in the bottom don't mean a tremendous amount here. But this is a really typical publication bias test. And publication bias, unlike some of the other things I've shown you, it's about what's not in the literature versus what is. And it would appear that when authors get quote unquote good response rates, 60, 70, 80% response rate, that's front and center in the methodology. They talk about that a lot, but if they don't get what they perceive as a good response rate, they tend to withhold it. So we looked across all of these published and unpublished studies, and what we found was this really asymmetrical distribution of response rates. And it just so happened to be that the low response rates were far less likely to be reported, and they were far less likely to be reported when sample size was small than when it was a high response rate with a high sample size. So that's what I mean by the response rate potentially showing signs of a non-response bias. deliberately withholding information that could potentially affect someone's opinion about whether or not the presence of non-response bias is an issue. And Heiko, do you think the statements, I have to do these things in order to get published in top journals, is justified? From an ethical perspective, no, it's not justified to do that, but it's somewhat understandable, right? There are certain things, I come from a department, I worked for the Department of Corrections for many years, and there was lots of things that I would see that on paper, dealing narcotics, when it's illegal to deal narcotics, is something that is going to get punished and probably should be punished. But is it justified? No. Is it understandable? Yes. Given the circumstances many of these people were raised in, I 100% understood why they made the choice that they made, even though it's not justified. So in our particular case, which obviously is not extreme as that one, I do think that a lot of people are either pressured to do this by perhaps sometimes in the review process, or they perceive that they have to do these things in order to get into top journals, that for whatever reason, that pressure is there and they succumb to it. And I've certainly been, now as a meta-analyst, as someone who does a lot of review articles and things like that, I don't feel that pressure as often, but I have worked on some primary data studies, and it really stinks when you get that p-value of 0.07. I'm so close, but I know the reviewer is going to push back on this if I use terms like marginally significant. So it's unfortunate, but it's certainly understandable what's going on. At least that's understandable to me. I shouldn't speak for other folks. And Sophie, I'm reading your question now. Oh, okay. So Sophie's question, this idea of going to the journal with an introduction and a method section. This is something that some journals are allowing. And ORM is an example, and probably the pioneer was Journal of Business and Psychology, which is Steve Rosenberg's journal that's currently at the helm. They have actually in their manuscript submission portal, they'll allow you to submit just a proposal, which will be your introduction and outlining of the methodology. It should be pretty complete. I mean, it should be, all right, here's this, these are theory-driven hypotheses, and here's exactly how I'm going to measure it in the setting that I plan on doing, or setting that I plan on sampling from. This is the population I want, and here's the justification for that. Once all that information is presented to the journal, they send it out for peer review. So it goes out to 2 or 3 reviews. It has an associate editor make a judgment call based on those reviews, and they're going to say, this is strong theory and this is good methodology. I like your hypotheses and I think they're going to be tested correctly. Go out, collect these data, and as long as you do what you say, we'll publish whatever you get. I mean, you have 10 hypotheses here, and if you come back and not a single one is supported, well, oh well, it's we agreed to publish it because it had rigor and it had relevance, and the fact the results didn't share your enthusiasm, so to speak, that's still okay. So that's that particular type of submission process. It's very close to what you're going to do for your dissertation proposal, right? You go in, here's my theory, here's my hypothesis, and here's my intended methodology. When you go to defend your dissertation, nobody should be talking about statistical significance as a problem. The only judgment is, was the proposal executed? And the only judgment they make at JBP during that second round is, did they execute the proposal that they approved? So I hope that helps. Carolyn's question. Should all journals move to the JBP model? I think that giving researchers the option to do that is great. I really don't like talking in absolute stuff. I think that every journal has a right to kind of set their own policy, but they should appreciate that some of the policies they set and informal policy norms, so to speak, that's going to encourage a lot of these practices that they're going to try, they want to avoid or hopefully want to avoid. So in thinking about that, I don't think that's what fixes the problem. It's one part of the solution. See, where it's Darley's law, right? Whatever you reward is going to be corrupted. And I think what happens is sometimes we fixate on one particular area, like null hypothesis significance testing. This is the bane of all existence. If we got rid of that, the problem goes away. It doesn't. People would always find a way to go around that. The idea here is we're trying to put in as many safeguards as possible. If there was one thing I'm going to recommend, I would say transparency. Far greater transparency. If people are, I think Goldacre said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. If we really push for transparency and we start to become a little more forgiving about results that don't share the enthusiasm of the introduction hypothesis section, then I think we start to move away from this. But it's really hard to just pick one or two things to go at the problem because in general there are workarounds that people may be engaging in. But all the same, I do really love what Steve and other journals like ORM are doing with this two-step submission process. But think about one of the challenges I would imagine that they face, by the way, is they go out and they do their research the traditional way. They don't get good results. Therefore, they pretend like they didn't collect the data and they submit the proposal. And then the proposal gets approved and they say, look, we just went out and collected all the data and it turns out nothing worked. So I think, again, there's ways to it that could potentially be problematic there. So let me go there and this question. I had, believe it or not, Maria, the chrysalis effect paper was not accepted at the first journal we submitted to. I think it moved pretty far. Now, we loved that it went to JOM, but initially we had sent it to a couple journals that we saw as this particular, this journal is part of the group that's really pushing hard. Everything has to be theory-driven. And that was one of our criticisms and one of the reasons why we thought we saw the chrysalis effect, and that really, they hated it. However, once we got Fred Oswald as an associate editor, there's always a high probability of the paper getting found. But once we had him as our associate editor, I knew it was going to get a fair shake. He's such a good guy, and he cares so much about the profession, not just the journal or career aspirations. He really does care about doing good science for the sake of doing good science. I was really excited when he was the AE, and then the reviewers were pretty positive on it. They had a lot of feedback on it because initially that paper was pretty different, perhaps a little more polemic, a little more inflammatory, and they really helped us make sure that this was not going to be a paper that just preached to the choir, that it wasn't going to be too argumentative, that it had an open mind about it. So we were grateful for that. Susanna, that's a really good question. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll try to speak louder. How about we start just by moving this thing a little bit closer? And sorry, high def is not my friend. As you're trying to validate some, so let's say you have this AMR paper, it has these propositions, and from that you go in and you're trying to develop hypotheses from that. The tips are going to be pretty close to what I said at the end. The biggest one being to go into that with as much theoretical and empirical support as possible. So if nothing's ever been tested on that, appreciate the fact that you're kind of in the dark there about whether that effect is going to be there. Because at the end of the day, AMR is a great journal, but it's a journal that publishes hunches. I think that this is going to be like this based on the extant literature. They're very well educated hunches, but they're hunches all the same. So I think that you could even set the paper up initially as that. Listen, I'm not trying to make an incremental contribution here. This isn't something where it's been found 20 different contexts. I'm going to test the 21st different context. You really are saying this is potentially groundbreaking, that we need to test a lot more of these propositions, which is a paper in itself, to go back and look at AMR and see how many propositions have actually been tested. But if you take that conceptual paper and you frame the introduction as I'm doing work that's really making a significant contribution, either supporting it or refuting it, Now, if you think that there's a high probability that some of your hypotheses won't work, which is probably the case, make sure that you have as much ammunition beforehand, which means you really make a strong effort on the power analysis to say, I need at least this number of people to have an 80% chance of detecting it. If it's there, then there's a good chance that that effect is somewhat robust, at least in the sample. And if it's not there, there's still a chance sampling error is there. It's 80% power, not 100% power. But at the same time, I did everything I could to test this proposition in good faith, and it still wasn't there. So yeah, these effects should try to replicate it again, but this proposition has perhaps one strike against it. Suzanne, again, I'm using 2 quasi-experiments to validate that. I love experiments because they are pretty high, they can often be powerful. This can be a really cool thing, though, if you are running not full replications, but if you're constructive replications and you have 2, 3, if you pick up a copy of JPSP now, like 9 different experiments, you can actually meta-analyze that at the end. And then you can say, this is about where the effect size is. Ignore this, whether it's significant or not. You can actually just say, the effects of this particular effect size is 0.045. And that's, here's the 95% confidence interval. That it includes 0 and doesn't include 0 isn't that important. What's important here is this is a relatively small effect size. This has implications for managing the same practitioners, XYZ. And Craig, am I optimistic or pessimistic about this issue in the field? I'm highly optimistic. I don't like studying things that there's not much that can be done about it. I think that this is a topic where we can make a lot of really positive changes. We have examples in other fields where it worked. Physics is a great example of that, where you'll still get bad apples. Like 20 years ago, somebody said that they invented cold fusion, and somebody went back and I don't know, they had like a couple of Duracell batteries and a potato hooked up. It didn't work. It was just completely fabricated. But for the most part, they have figured out how to do it, and the way that they've done it is, again, lots and lots of transparency. They just put their papers up online, and they let the community, they kind of crowdsource their papers, and their reward system is much more based on a general sense that this person's doing good work in the field, and they go to good blogs and they talk to like PubPeer and places like that, and try to figure out the best way to, or they try to evaluate that person based on their overall contribution to the field, as opposed to any single paper or what I benefited from the system of counting. How many A hits? Okay, well for tenure, this is the right number of A hits, and this person has 9. That's a pretty foreign idea to some of the hard sciences. And increasingly, we're seeing some of that stuff go on, even slowly getting into business schools through places like the finance departments and economics departments. So I'm hopeful, and I do think A&D is a great journal. One of the challenges A&D faces is kind of what we might expect, which is it's not on my journal list if I'm not going to submit to it. I think that we as researchers, we can't complain about the problem, and then when somebody offers a potential solution to us, like Vanderbilt's doing, to not take them up on that. So I think people will begin to hopefully start to submit to that journal on a much more regular basis, and that's going to be a go-to journal. Something to pick up, and you know what you're getting at that journal, because there's not much incentive to present statistically significant results. And it's not just an HST, it's really anything. Age and credibility. There's not that motivation to do that. So that's why I do love A&D. Not sure whether to report the number of participants who did not pass my quality check. Would you report those to us? So very specific question about you report, and I'm going to refer you back to that very generic answer at the beginning, which is, do you think a reasonable person would want to know that information? And if so, how much space were you going to take to report it? If it turns out this is one sentence and you're a little concerned, which sounds like you are, I'd say go ahead and report it. I don't expect you to give? I mean, for something like that, we don't have hard and fast rules about how many participants pass a quality check, and most people don't even do quality checks. So I think you're already above the majority of the field when you do something like that. So yeah, I cleaned my data, and that just so happens that 5 or 10% or maybe even more people are gone. That's true. My sample size is smaller, but let's not forget my data are better. My data are going to more. They're going to represent the population that we want to represent, and I think this is the best way moving forward is dropping these subjects, dropping these potential participants. It's a good question, though. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, everybody, it's 3 o'clock, so we might get started with our second component of the hot topics session. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mike Withers. Mike is an assistant professor of management at the Mays School of Business at Texas A&M. He studies corporate governance, director selection, the management of resource dependencies through the board of directors. Like our previous presenter, Ernest O'Boyle, Mike is extraordinarily productive. If you ever want to feel bad about yourself and the amount of time you're wasting, just have a look at Mike's Vita. Similar to Ernest, we're in great hands with Mike. He's going to be talking about the E word, the great bugaboo that keeps us all up at night in strategic management, endogeneity. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I really appreciate that. Really glad to be with you guys today to talk about this topic. I think it's an interesting, to say the least. Hopefully you can see my presentation slides there and can hear me quite well. But I'm going to talk about endogeneity today, and I'm going to focus on a particular type. So we could talk about sample-induced endogeneity, we could talk about treatment effects, we can even talk about dynamic panel models and the role of Ariano Bond models to address endogeneity. But I'm going to talk today about instrumental variables as a way to address endogeneity, in part because it's probably one of the most used and most common methods in strategic management. So today, what I hope to do is discuss strategic management research and endogeneity, define endogeneity more directly, discuss the causes of endogeneity, talk about that instrumental variable approach, and I'm going to share with you some research that I did with Matt Simondini and Travis Serto that looked at instrumental variable relevance and strength and how it influences your results. And then I'll just end with some recommendations. So to get started, maybe an example would help here. So as you can see, a researcher hypothesizes that board acquisition experience increases acquisition activity. A series of OLS regressions support that hypothesis with the following controls: total assets, ROA, and a series of industry controls. Could the results potentially be biased by or because of endogeneity? My answer would be yes, and there's a couple of reasons. One, it could be an omitted variable problem. So if you see our control variables here, one of the issues that might occur is that we didn't control for CEO or top management team acquisition experience. And that could be an omitted variable that influences our results. The second part, or the second problem, could be that board composition reflects the fact that a firm wants to engage in more acquisitions, and so they hire or select directors with greater acquisition experience. In both cases, you could have an issue where OLS regression would give you biased results. And that kind of leads into why strategic management is such a field that faces an endogeneity problem, or as Craig was saying, that E, no one really wants to talk about in a lot of ways. And I think this quote really helps to capture that idea. Hamilton and Nickerson pointed out the field of strategic management is fundamentally predicated on the idea that management's decisions are endogenous to their expected performance outcome. If not, managerial decision-making is not strategic, it's superfluous. And if you think about it, the ideal way to examine causality is through experiments. But in strategic management research, we can't really say, well, let's assign a bunch of different strategies to different firms randomly and see what the results are. If we could, that would be the ideal way to go about testing some of our models, but we just can't do that. So we have to deal with what econometricians discuss as dirty data. We use a lot of proxy data, a lot of big data in a lot of ways to get at these problems, but they're not, by their definition, experimental. So we often deal with endogeneity. In part, this quote reflects the fact that if our field doesn't face an endogeneity problem, we're probably a field that's superfluous as well, because it really is predicated on that idea that managers are making decisions that are not random. At least we hope not, right? So in strategic management research, there have been a number of studies that have highlighted this issue or examined it directly. Probably one of the first studies to really do this was the Shaver 1998 piece that looked at entry mode decisions and highlighted how unobservable factors could influence both the independent variable and the error term, thus being really influenced by endogeneity. And so he walks through and shows that outcome. As I just used the quote from Hamilton and Nickerson, you can see they review and document the role that endogeneity plays in strategy research, and I think does a nice job of overviewing that problem, although they're particularly focused on treatment effects. FASCO 2008 offers an overview of instrumental variables and describes the importance of exogeneity and relevance in great detail. And then what the Cimadini study does is use simulations to examine that exogeneity and relevance and shows endogeneity and how it biases OLS results. And then finally, Certo, Busenbark, Wu, and Cimadini have recently had a paper in SMJ that's in press right now on sample-induced endogeneity and the use of Heckman correction models. So if you have a case where you might have a sample-induced endogeneity problem, their paper walks through very nicely how to address that. But in general, you can see that there have been a number of studies that have examined this problem, in part, again, and reflecting that Hamilton and Nickerson quote. It's a big problem for us in strategy in particular. Although I will say also, John Antonakis and his colleagues have been really kind of championing the issue in organizational behavior as well, or that micro research as well. So just to define endogeneity more directly, you can see that it's when the independent variable, or focal independent variable in most cases, but really any independent variable is correlated with the error term in the statistical model. And so in this case, the regressor is endogenous if it violates that zero conditional mean assumption, which, as you guys are aware, is one of the key assumptions of OLS. When that assumption is violated, the OLS regression becomes inconsistent. So what we find are the results are biased here. And when endogeneity is present, it can provide some very heavily biased results. I'll show you guys, again, some results in a little bit that really brings that to bear. Now, in mathematical form, you can kind of see, just using the basic OLS regression model, what the problem looks like. Obviously, we're assuming the endogeneity in this model, but you can see we have just a basic regression model with k number of covariates. And we set up with the assumption that the covariance between our covariates and our error term is equal to 0, meaning there's no correlation. And that's for our covariates 1 through k minus 1. And so what that sets up is a case where xk might be correlated with E. And if that is the case, it is endogenous, whereas the other variables based on the assumption above is exogenous. Now we'll talk again about what that means, but this is just kind of showing what that mathematically looks like when someone says you have an endogeneity problem. What they're really saying is that you potentially have a correlation between your focal covariate and that error term there, or that focal independent variable and the error term there. So what are the sources of endogeneity? How does this problem arise? Well, there are a number of issues that can drive this. One is measurement error. And so we're talking about errors and variables, which we often see in the micro literature, is they're trying to really ensure that there's valid, reliable measures used. Well, we could have that same problem using proxy measures. And so errors and variables can be a problem and can lead to endogeneity. For an excellent review of that, you can again check out the Antonakis et al. Paper that was in LQ. Another issue, and really probably the main driver of the endogeneity problem, is the omitted variable problem. And so the omitted variable bias is said to be the most commonly encountered problem in social and behavioral science. The example I gave a little bit earlier was showing that directly. So in this case, an omitted variable could be producing the significant relationship between your main IV, or your main independent variable, and the dependent variable. Another issue that can drive endogeneity is simultaneous causality. So if causality goes in both directions, to really determine that causal relationship can obviously be problematic, but it also can lead to biased results. So if we have X leading to Y, but also Y leading to X, that can create endogeneity. And in some ways, it's an extension of the omitted variable problem, because we're not including in there that Y to X relationship. And then finally, as I was mentioning, sample selection can also lead to endogeneity, but as the Certo et al. In press paper indicates, it's a different form of endogeneity, and one that you have to be aware of. As they point out, though, if you have a endogeneity driven by one of these other three factors, that can often really supersede the sample selection bias, and you want to address the endogeneity driven by these other factors rather than the sample selection in that case. And you can actually use a Heckman model for that. Now, again, as I was saying earlier, we're going to focus on the most common method that's often used to address endogeneity, and that's the use of instrumental variables. And the use of instrumental variables often comes in the form of a two-stage least squares model or 2SLS model. And so we're going to focus particularly on that, and then again I'm going to show you guys some results from the Senodini et al. Study that looked at how two-stage least square models address endogeneity and how the instrumental variables can really influence whether you find significant endogeneity problems or not. So just the underlying logic of the 2SLS model, as you would guess, it has two steps in it, right? And so the first step is to obtain the fit values of the xk from the regression x hat k on these different covariates, including some instrumental variables, which is represented by the z's here. So this is that first stage of the regression. The next stage, at least in OLS regression, is to run y on those same covariates, and this time not include the instrumental variables, but include those predicted values from that first stage. And so those predicted values really allow you to address the endogeneity that occurs from that overlap in the endogenous variable and that error term. In some ways, it takes out and really focuses on just that value, or just that portion of the main focal variable that is not influenced by the endogenous relationship. Now, if you want to see an excellent review of that, Kennedy does a really nice job of that, provides some Venn diagrams that can help explain that logic. I have that reference at the back of the slides as well. As you can see, that we need at least one exogenous variable or instrumental variable in the first stage that doesn't appear in the second stage, and so that's why, again, we're calling this an instrumental variable approach. And if you don't have that, the model is not identified and you can't use this approach. So you need instrumental variables in order to employ the two-stage least squares model approach to addressing endogeneity. So when you're looking for instrumental variables, it really becomes a critical question of how can we find these. And so finding these variables, you can use continuous or discrete variables. It really doesn't matter about the distributional assumptions there. And really the focus becomes looking at these variables that are relevant and exogenous. And so that's the critical thing. So we want them to be theoretically relevant, but also exogenous to the model. And so just to talk a little bit about that, again, this idea of theoretical relevance becomes critical. Although, as one of my colleagues likes to say, Stata doesn't know if these instrumental variables are theoretically relevant, so we have to look at these diagnostics. And so in the first stage of regression analysis in this two-stage least square model, we have to look at the instruments and see if they explain a significant portion of the dependent variable. The way to do that is to look at the F statistic, or if you're including the control variable, it would be a partial F statistic. And so you can see some recommendations here on the number of instruments and how large your F statistic or partial F statistic should be. And so here, if you have one instrumental variable, you need to have an F statistic of at least 8.96. If you have two, 11.59, and so on and so forth. The key thing is we want strong, relevant instruments here. And if the F statistic is low, then your instrumental variables are deemed weak. And again, I'm going to show you guys what happens when you have weak instrumental variables here. The next thing is exogeneity, and this is kind of the assumption that if you're going to use instrumental variables, they can't themselves be endogenous as well. So in this case, you need to have the number of instruments exceed the number of the number of endogenous regressors, and so the equation is over-identified. Again, Basco talks directly about this and discusses three these tests that you can employ: the Sargan or Hansen-J statistic, the Baskin statistic, or the difference in Sargan statistic. These are all easy to do. The Baum 2006 piece or book in Stata walks you directly through these. And you can see here a failure to reject each type of the statistic means that the instruments can be considered exogenous. Now, Murray talks about this directly in 2006 and says that all instruments arrive on the scene with a dark cloud of invalidity hanging overhead. And so it's really our job to ensure that we can reduce that cloudiness around the instrumental variables. And the reason you need more than one or for your instruments to exceed the number of endogenous regressors is what you end up doing is taking one instrumental variable and assuming that it is exogenous to test to see if the other instrumental variables are also endogenous. So that's kind of why you need kind of that Z+1, if you will, with the instrumental variables. Now, once you have those instrumental variables and you're able to do the two-stage least square model, what you can then do is the Durbin-Wu-Hausman test to see if you had an endogeneity problem or not. And so what you end up doing is doing a test that involves fitting the model by both LLS and instrumental variable approaches and then comparing the results. If the coefficients from both approaches aren't statistically different, then LLS is appropriate. You could still use the two-stage least square model, but they're less efficient. And so what you would want to do is again, use the LLS approach if it's appropriate, because the standard errors will be smaller and your model will be more efficient there. And again, there are several ways to perform the DWH test in Stata. Baum 2006 and Cameron and Trivedi 2010 lay out very detailed and direct ways of going about doing that. So again, I wanted to walk through the simulation that we did to show kind of what influence this has here, both on testing for endogeneity, but also just in how it influences the two-stage least square results. So this is from the Sinodini et al. 2014 paper. And you can see the effects of endogeneity. Here we're just going to start with a baseline. And what we did was we simulated betas, standard errors, the 95 percentile intervals, and the percentage significance. And so when we looked at this, we started with no endogeneity. And so our beta, or our coefficient, was 0.1. And that is the true value here. Standard error was 0.45, and we had where the value there was within the 95% confidence interval 95% of the time, which makes sense, right? And 60% of the time that coefficient was significant running simulations on this. Now to compare this, and this again being the true relationship where no endogeneity is present, the beta is 0.1, you can see once we increased endogeneity to a low amount or to a medium amount based on effect sizes, we started to see increases in bias here. And you can see that bias in looking at the betas. The beta of 0.2 when we have low endogeneity. So our effect size pretty much doubles there. And then when we increased the endogeneity to 0.3, or that correlation between X and our error term by 0.3, it increased the beta to 4 times the original value. We'd actually originally started this study by wondering if you only had a small amount of endogeneity, would that create a problem? And we were sad to find that yes, that is exactly the case. So you can see even with low levels of endogeneity, it biases the result pretty significantly. And so then we wanted to start looking at the instruments and say, well, what if we had weak instrumental variables or if we had endogenous instrumental variables? So again, those two key assumptions when you're doing the two-stage least square analysis. So here you can see when you have weak instruments versus when you have moderately strong instruments, the effects here. When we had weak instrumental variables, the effect size again was biased, this time in the opposite direction when we had low endogeneity. And then you can see here with moderate, the value was pretty close to exactly what it was. Now at the same time, you can see with weak instruments, the beta was pretty much where it should be in terms of the true value. The problem here, again, you can see the standard errors are substantially higher, so the likelihood of finding a significant result, even when the true relationship is significant, drops substantially when you have weak instruments and you're using this less efficient method. And then finally, when we had weak instruments or moderately strong instruments, and they were endogenous, meaning that they were not themselves exogenous, you can see it really gets to affecting the results here, where the betas jump up substantially, and the standard errors also go up. So really affected the results there. Again, if the baseline was 0.1, you can see that our results were significantly influenced. So what this means is if you have weak instruments, or if you have endogenous instruments themselves, that can really create a lot of problems for you. So you have to be very clear and really focus on finding good instruments. And that also affects our test for endogeneity. And so here again, you can see with doing the DWH test, we were, in this case, with weak instruments, likely to not find endogeneity. And you can see when we do have endogenous instruments, we didn't find any endogeneity as a problem. And so the key point here is an insignificant test of endogeneity might indicate poor instruments rather than a lack of endogeneity. So it's something to keep in mind. So based on that, just to leave you guys with some recommendations here, the first thing is to start by considering endogeneity. Think about as you're beginning a study or your dissertation and say, well, could endogeneity be an issue here? And if so, start thinking about the instrumental variables early on. This is probably one of the big differences between our study and BASCL, again, which I really like. But the BASCL piece provided this flow chart, and the initial question was, well, is endogeneity a problem? If you answered no, you just keep going through the process. If you answered yes, then you would need to go get instrumental variables. The problem, though, is that you need to have the instrumental variables to be able to test for that endogeneity. So we really set up in our study to say you need to find these instrumental variables early on and think about them, in part because they're very difficult to find, or at least good ones are very difficult to find. And so that kind of goes into the second recommendation. Use theory to select and justify your recommendations. And I can tell you, working with reviewers or having that conversation with reviewers about addressing endogeneity, you really want to make sure you're using theory to show why your instruments are valid, or again, that strength of the relationship between your instrumental variables and your potentially endogenous regressor. Then you want to estimate and report that first stage and those diagnostics that we walked through, and then you'd want to estimate that second stage. And if you have multiple instruments, you may want to show robustness to the choice of instrument there. Again, as I was talking about, some of those diagnostic tests really depend on the assumption that one instrument is valid, and then you can test whether the others are valid. So doing some comparisons there, if you have multiple instruments, becomes critical and a nice way to ensure your results are good. And then finally, report the LLS results and compare and contrast the two approaches. Again, the DWH test works up or is set up to really do just that. So that helps to, I think, provide some clarity around what we're doing when we're testing for endogeneity. We actually did a search of studies that have used instrumental variable approaches and strategy, and we kind of point this out in the paper. It was very difficult to find examples where it was clear and direct what the authors did. And that's not to say that the authors were doing anything incorrect. It's just that we need to be very transparent about what we're doing when we're approaching these endogeneity issues. So with that, thanks for taking the time to listen. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to at least answer them. And while we're doing that, I'll just put these references up here as well. So thanks again. Absolutely. Sorry about that. Yeah, so Maria was asking any advice on how to anticipate if I'm working with weak or strong instruments. So those diagnostics that I walked through actually help you directly with that. So if you go through the Baskel study, you'll see this directly. Walking through, again, if you're looking at the strength, and this is that point about Stata not really knowing your theory per se, but it can provide you with that F statistic to say, okay, you have strong instruments. And that's kind of the first step, to make sure you have that strong or strong instruments. And then the next step would be to have multiple instruments. Again, if you have one potentially endogenous variable, you'd at least want two instrumental variables to do these different tests that again, Baskel walks through, the Hansen-J statistic or the Sargan test. And again, Baum, 2006, An Introduction to Modern Econometrics. His chapter 8 just walks you directly through how to do this. And so as you're doing it, it really does become pretty clear how to go about doing this. Now, again, the problem is finding instrumental variables, and we kind of point that out in the study we did. It's kind of a chicken and the egg in some ways, but it becomes kind of a critical issue to have really good instrumental variables. And so, again, looking at the Baskel piece and the Baum, and also the Simodini study, we try to walk through some of those things. But those diagnostics are readily available and pretty easy to use as well. You'll find if you've not done instrumental variable analysis in Stata, it's pretty direct, and there are a number of helpful guides for that, both online, but I would recommend highly the Baum 2006 book, as well as the Cameron and Trivedi book. They're both really great because they are very hands-on and walking you through that. So, yeah. Yeah, so Craig asked if you use two instruments for one IV, do both instruments need to be exogenous, or can it be only one of them? You would want both of them to be exogenous. This is a great question. You want both of them to be exogenous, but this is that assumption that I was talking about. We really don't know truly if one or both of them is exogenous. We have to assume one is exogenous and then run the analysis with that as the assumption. It's called the orthogonal assumption. And so you do that, and say you have instrumental variables Z1 and Z2. Well, we run our IV reg model, and we assume first that Z1 is exogenous, and we tell Stata that that's exactly what we're setting up. We're setting up that orthogonal assumption. And then we can test whether Z2 is orthogonal or exogenous. And then we can go back through and do the exact same thing, but changing that over where you have now Z2 is the assumed exogenous variable. And so it's as best as we can do to reduce that cloudiness that I was talking about from Murray 2006. It really is true that we can never reduce that dark cloud around this, but we can do as much as possible to try to do so. So we theoretically would want both of them to be exogenous, but we can't really test them without assuming one is exogenous from the other, or exogenous from our error term, and then testing to see if the other one is as well based on that assumption. But again, that's directly how you can approach that. Hope that answers that question. Yeah. So Susanna asked, the main challenge for new researchers to handle the E issue is that existing publications contain results that embed it with E issues, as Antonakis gave a long list in his paper, which is absolutely right. I find constrained when constructing micro studies because we can't have very long surveys to include too many variables in the model. Otherwise, we are accused of fishing a right model. Any tips? Yeah, that's kind of a difficult issue, and I think it's going to become more and more of a problem as we're going forward. I think this is why the Antonakis work and bringing it up to our micro colleagues is so important. And it's not an easy issue to really address. But I will bring up a side issue that I think is relevant as well, especially on the macro side, and I hope this relates to your question, Susanna, as well. In the strategy research realm, we're starting to see more of an emphasis on replications, and you can see this with Rich Bettis's and the editorial team at SMJ for this call for replications, or to have that embedded replication with control variables we choose. And so the issue becomes when we're building on prior research that haven't taken or hasn't taken into consideration that endogeneity problem. When we're adding control variables in there that themselves could be potentially endogenous and could bias our results as well. So from a macro standpoint, that's kind of the thing that my colleagues and I have been recently thinking about. What happens when you're trying to do these studies that in a similar way are trying to replicate a control. Now, directly on the micro side, I think if you look at some of the work on control variables, that really becomes helpful in trying to address some of this. I think, if I'm not mistaken, some of Spector's work on looking at control variables can help here. You know, if you think about why you're choosing to include controls, we often don't do a good enough job providing the theoretical rationale for why we're doing so. And so I think if you are studying something and there is that potential omitted variable bias, I think you should add that to your survey and should include that and speak directly in the write-up of the study why you initially included that in your survey, why you did that. And again, I think transparency helps as well. So I know that's kind of two different perspectives on that one question, one almost from a macro standpoint and what it means when we're able to put 20 control variables in a model. And I think for at least the macro researchers, we're seeing this more and more. Reviewers are asking us to just put everything and the kitchen sink in our models, and that can be a problem. For our micro colleagues, though, it can be a different problem in that you can't just control for all these things because those controls aren't as readily available. So in that case, what do you do? Well, I think looking back at the Spector work and seeing how you determine what control variables to include in there and how to go about doing that can really help. So again, that's not directly, I think, addressing your issue because it really is a problematic issue moving forward, I think, for all of us. But I do think bringing it to light, as Antonakis has done, both in the LQ paper that I've got listed up here and also a book chapter that he and his colleagues did, I think is really helpful. But again, it's one of those that can be pretty problematic as well. Yeah, so Craig is asking here, what about some of the work we see in strategy with things like CEO disposition and values or the ID? Can we assume exogeneity, or is this still a potential selection bias issue? Also, how could we instrument for something like disposition? Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about those type of questions and the role of endogeneity when we have these things that might be ingrained in the individual. You know, it does kind of go back to that quote from Hamilton and Nickerson, the strategic decisions that these individuals are making, and this I think really connects to that upper echelon's perspective that's reflected in Craig's question. You have our entire perspective of upper echelons based on the fact that looking at these type of characteristics more directly, if you are looking at CEO personality or disposition, can provide a way into understanding how they go about formulating strategy. So then it becomes a question of, yeah, are these individuals selecting the strategy? Say if they're a narcissist, are they selecting strategies that's going to keep them in the press, and does that mean that we would have something that's endogenous? It's kind of interesting, and again, this might be a point where our micro colleagues could actually help us address this, and it's an interesting question. I, to be honest, have not thought too much about that and what that might mean in trying to address endogeneity. Now, I will say, if you were going to instrument for something like that, I think you would go about doing, just as we were discussing today, walking through that. But what we would consider instrumental variables for CEO personality would become kind of interesting. Now, I will say as well, we might be able to look at the labor economics research, which obviously was the initial driver sample-induced endogeneity. So the Heckman research comes out of these labor economic studies. And you do see kind of elements of that. So why do you decide to go into the workplace? Well, it could be your educational background, it could be your motivation. So all of those things could almost create that sample selection bias. And so those things, yeah, would lead to an issue that could really be problematic. So I think, and again, no, this isn't directly answering that question, but this could be really one where our micro colleagues would inform this endogeneity discussion that seems to be such a hot topic right now in strategic management, and at the same time really looking back at the labor economic side. And yeah, I agree with you, Craig. I think selecting on narcissism for boards, that could be an interesting study, right? And what that might entail, and what that might mean for our boards as well when you have that too. So that's right. Yeah, absolutely. I think I guess it's kind of a referendum this year on what that narcissism might mean in U.S. political systems, right? So. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys, and hope you have a good rest of your afternoon. And you know, like I said, I think the one thing is thinking about endogeneity early in the study process can really help this. So again, all the best with your research as you do go about addressing the E problem. So thanks again.
Can everybody hear me okay? Thanks. It's still uploading. I have a little bit more to upload, but I'll go ahead and let's hope it all works. Looks like it's coming up. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see the slides as well. Sorry about the late start. I am a department head, and I was coming from a department head meeting, but I'm very passionate about using visual and research, so that's why I signed on with Chris and Karen to do this today. Is there anything I need? Let's see, there's quite a bit of squeaking. Make sure you click the green speaker button while you talk. I need to turn off. I turned off the speakers. My speakers are muted. Do you have any other ideas? Let's see, maybe is my microphone too high? Is it better now? I don't want to start. Okay, all right. So again, my name's Ann Smith, and I'm delighted to be here with you today and talk about what I'm really passionate about, which is visual in research. And I'm the kind of person, I don't plan on doing a 30-minute talk and then I want to get some interaction going early on. But again, just to talk a little bit, I am a department head now, and I was coming from a meeting from that. And again, I love doing this presentation because I'm very passionate about this, and maybe I'll hope to inspire some of you to undertake visual methods when you're in the field and undertaking some research. So I'm going to start off with the first question, which is, what is qualitative research? What is qualitative research? I'm just curious, if you had to define what qualitative research is, what is qualitative research? A few people are typing, so I'm going to wait and see. So qualitative research is the why that explains qualitative data, okay? And Paula, what do you mean by qualitative data? The why that explains quant data. All right, that's cool, no problem. Mohammed said the one that you want to conduct, the way you want to conduct it, and you have rich information. Yeah, all right. Let's see, a few other people typing, so I'm going to be curious to see. Susan says, data consisting of text, visuals, and other non-numeric material. Absolutely, that's one part of it. A few more people are going to catch my breath while y'all are typing. So Paula Buchanan responded back, qualitative provides a more detailed explanation. Well, I'm going to shut down my email as well. Excuse me. All right. So Paula said qualitative provides a more detailed explanation of the what of quant or the so what after you have quantitative results. Katerina Gonzalez says empirical data where qualitative data, as opposed to quant, which is an important distinction, data are used such as interviews, observations. So I asked this, Karen Jansen said my favorite when only quantitative data is called empirical. Yeah, that's a pet peeve of mine as well, when they don't consider qualitative research. I want to start off with this because I think it's an important distinction to make, and I'm very influenced by a paper that I was the associate editor on a couple of months ago. But when we think of qualitative data, it is about or qualitative research. It is about the data, and it's also about the inquiry. So, when you think about qualitative data, I took this directly from a 2005 organizational research method. And mostly, unfortunately, no one said it here, but usually when people think about qualitative research, they think about non-numeric data that is associated with induction, whereas quantitative research is quantitative data or numeric data associated with more deductive approaches. So when you normally talk about confirmatory with numeric, we normally think of quantitative research as C and qualitative as B. But in this table that came directly from Lonnie Balin's contribution to this really interesting article in ORM, she talked about how, and it irks me as well when people talk about qualitative research. What do you really mean? And so I thought I'd start off with this and talk about qualitative research really is about what type of data you're dealing with, but also what's the mode of analysis. And I think for both, her argument is for both verbal or visual or numeric, you can be both confirmatory as well as exploratory. Let me continue here. When we think about qualitative, we are thinking about qualitative data. And one of the people that responded, Susan, mentioned that it was text or verbal, photographs, but I also want to open your eyes to there's lots of other types of data that will fit into this non-numeric category, such as visual or sound, smell, taste, touch, and movements, which we had just scratched the really just we've just begun to think about those as data sources. Now, I just came from Karma. I was teaching last week a short course up in Detroit, and we dealt a lot, but the whole 2.5-day session was about interrogating textual data. And we looked at it both through a confirmatory lens, using dictionaries, as well as through a more exploratory lens in which we were letting the meaning emerge from the transcripts and such. So kind of covered that first thing there, and I highly recommend taking a short course or whatever. But the photographs is an area that I think also is an area of wide open application. So when I think about qualitative data, when I think about qualitative research, one component is what type of data are we dealing with, and usually it's non-numeric. But again, it's a huge array of different types of data sources. So when we talk about what is qualitative research, it's really too general a label and needs further description. When we think about, in this 2x2 that we have here, qualitative research would really be the row that follows verbal. It would include both A and B. But you might find that cell number D, which is numeric exploratory, would be an area of like no research land. But that's the fun thing about this article, because the premise was, can you do grounded theory on numeric data? And the answer is, of course, yes, data are data. And again, Barney Glazer's actually, he was on the panel in the paper, but he also has written a book about quantitative grounded theory. So I just want us to think about that when we think about qualitative research, it can be both confirmatory as well as exploratory, but it's usually dealing with non-numeric data. That's my simplistic definition of that. So are there any questions about that? It's a really nice piece in this side of this article. I would highly recommend you read. Lonnie Balin's taught a lot of different qualitative scholars, so I would highly recommend that article to take a read of it. Okay, so when we talk about photographs, I just want to get on the front end. When we talk about photographs, photographs can take many different forms. It can be, an article in a magazine. It can be a scrapbook. You have pictures in the scrapbook, or photographs on a wall. There's a great Journal of Management Studies article where they were looking at photographs of founders and chief executives of a particular Scandinavian company. It was in a special issue probably 10 years ago. So photographs can be archival. They can be researcher generated, like you enter the field with a camera, or they can be user created. And this is where participants go into the field or in their own setting and take photographs given a prompt by the researcher. And they can also create a couple of photographs, or they can create a presentation with photographs. So when we talk about photographs, we really are referring to all three types, and there are probably some more that I haven't identified there. Okay, so this is the way my talk's going to be organized. I realize we're running a few minutes late, but I think we'll have plenty of time for questions. And please feel free. I'm keeping an eye on the messaging system if you have a question. But I've organized my talk into 4 pastures, if you will. And if I don't have time, we may not get to the photographs and teaching. But I had an article at Journal Management Education on that. But I want to talk about why use photographs in research. Now, many years ago, I did one of those Karma talks, and with me was John Van Manen, and he made a really interesting comment, and he said, you know, we have enough data, why do we need photographs as well? And there's some truth in that. So why include photographs in research? Can't we get enough just with interviewing? Second is why use photographs in field research, or several uses of photographs in field research. We're going to talk about 3 or 4 different ways. And then the title of this talk was visual analysis, but I will tell you that's an area that needs a lot of work. I'm going to show you how I go about, doing some analysis with photographs inside a computer-aided qualitative data analysis software program. But we'll talk about that in brief. There's a need for a lot of research, a lot of work here. And then photographs and teaching. All right, so why even think about doing photographs? Well, if you look at some of these quotes, and then you also, I highly advise you to read the paper in the Academy of Management Annals in 2003. That's a great paper, but more attention is being devoted to visual methods inside of more qualitative-oriented methodologies. And the quote by Parker is, we live in a world that's increasingly visually oriented, and we're beginning to see some of this in accounting, and certainly marketing has a tradition of inclusion of photographs, but again, mostly we're privileging text. Mostly we privilege the interview data and the textual data, the verbal data. Another quote by Doug Harper, who's a visual sociologist. It's very well known and written many, many books on visual sociology. He says photo elicitation is one type of way of using photographs, but organizational studies using visual certainly as a waif in the margins rather than a robust actor in a developing research tradition. And Paula Buchanan says using data also helps communicate more effectively across various learning styles. Agreed as well. Certainly, visual studies have been slow to appear, even though if you go back and you read the A&J editorial by Tina Bansal and Kevin Corley, probably 5 years ago, they talk about that they're open to other types of data forms, and they mention visual, and I believe photographs as well in that editorial. So the door is open. There's more interest in it, but it's very early stages, I think, in organizational studies and incorporating visual into our research methodologies, more exploratory research methodologies. I love this quote. It's Curtis LeBaron. He does a lot with video analysis, but he had a quote, I think I'm paraphrasing it here, but so much of strategy is affected by interacting bodies and artifacts at hand. Instead of just privileging talk, there's a need to capture more of organizational life, and I tend to believe that as well. So why do it? Why now? Well, Alan Meyer, back in 1991 at ASQ, he has this great article where he's talking about a need to include more visual drawings. I mean, that is really interesting. We did a little bit of that in the short course last week. It's really fun, and it's a neat visual method to include inside of a research program. And but now what we see when we move forward, really right around 2012 and even up to today, it's very low cost, and most people have an iPhone or some sort of phone with a camera, so it's very low cost. In fact, I had a honor student do a project this past year in which he was studying minority internship experiences. And over the summer, he had 4 women at 4 different times in the summer use their smartphone and take a picture to capture their emotion at that moment. And then he interviewed them later in September. But again, most people have phones, and you can send them a text message to take a photograph, and they can do that. They can even write a memo and maybe express how they're feeling attached to the photograph. Most photographs are easy to manipulate. I think that this is an advantage, and while we probably will see more photographic inclusion as a method as opposed to video, I find video a little bit tricky to deal with, but I'm a little bit older and not as technologically savvy. So, but I find working with photographs very, very easy. And it also fits with the interpretive term and organizational studies. Photographs give us a way to get close to participants, and I'm going to talk more about that and hear their voice and their lived experience. So why now? I think we have the technology and the interest. As well, we can build on a tradition. There's no reason we have to reinvent the wheel. There are rich traditions in visual anthropology that go back to the 1930s, or actually before that even, and in sociology. We see other business disciplines that are interested in this as well. And it's a growing interest in Europe. There are a lot of UK researchers that I've gotten to know and know their work and doing some excellent research with visual methods. And again, this provides an opportunity to learn across disciplines. So why include photographs? I think we've addressed that. There's a need, and there's the technology, and so now we have to think about how to incorporate it and how do we use it in field research. And so I want to talk briefly about that. There are 4 uses of photographs in the field, and even if you've read my paper and you may have seen the Carmen talk I did, there's some new material here because I've been working on and doing some things with photographs since that paper. So basically, it's a documentation or photo elicitation interviews, creating participant narratives with photographs, and then creating photo voice events. So let me talk about each one of these. So what do you think the benefits are to using photographs to document research or field experience? What do you think? What do you think that there's a benefit to that? What are some benefits to documenting your field experience? You increase communication channel richness, okay. Bring more context to your text, yes, okay. Well, why else might you use photographs to document your field experience? It helps your memory, absolutely, absolutely. It captures something you might not have seen when you were there. Certainly, those little details that you might have overlooked. Helps make notes about the situation and remember emotions, absolutely. Those are all great. It can help you remember. I think that's one feature of documentation. And Susan, I did see your question, and if I don't get to it in the talk, make sure that I come back to it. It can allow you to do a quantitative analysis of visual depiction. Yes, if you go back and you read some of the early work by Collier, he would take pictures of recent immigrant homes and then catalog what he saw in terms of the inclusion of previous culture into the U.S. culture. It displays rigor by adding more representation of collection work, yeah, more details in terms of temporal and spatial aspect, absolutely, these are great. There are many more that I have on my next slide, but I feel like the benefits that I've had when I've gone into the field and I've taken pictures or I've captured my lived experience is it does capture your lived experience. You can remember again. Also, you think about it, the first time you go into any organization, you see things that perhaps even the participants don't see. You never get that chance again to catch something that you find interesting in the setting because you have fresh eyes. It also can increase your legitimacy and trustworthiness in your field research to say, yeah, I really was there, and I was there so much that the organization or the individuals let me take pictures of them. They trusted me to that extent. And it also can allow, and you think about field research and being in the field, and we can understand how to share interview data, but how can you explain and share the richness of being in the field if someone wanted to join your research team? Well, if you have photographs, they at least have a window in to that period of time. And so I think that's one thing that you can use photographs to document your experience to allow other researchers who join the project to feel like they're part of it and to understand in more depth what was going on in there. So here are some photographs. I hope you can see them. There's some classics. This over here, I don't know if you can see I think you can see my cursor there. This was actually my lived experience when I did my dissertation. I didn't use any computer software until much later. I had flip charts, and they were all in my duplex in my living room, and I lived with them. So I captured it because I guess I was a little bit paranoid. Like, do people really know how deeply I immersed myself in the analysis and trying to understand what the story was and the data? And now up here we have Tina Dason and her colleagues. They took a picture of the Cambridge Dining Hall. That's what their AMJ recently was about in 2010. And then one of my favorite pictures down here is Helen Muller's paper in the Journal of Management Inquiry, where she looked at American Indian women managers, and they captured these wonderful women, one of which I used to work with out in the University of New Mexico. She captured them in her paper. So sometimes we put pictures in our papers to entertain or to show people that we were there and perhaps add a bit of trustworthiness. So we see that's been primarily the use in the most academic papers of organizational studies. So when we talk about documentation, there are a lot of reasons to do it. And again, many times it remains behind the scenes, and we probably don't analyze those pictures, those documentation pictures. When we move more to the other ones, the photo elicitation interviews, we begin to see that we can, the pictures can become part of the analysis. And not to say they can't be done before, but again, mostly I've used the documentation to include others and to understand the lived experience when I went into the field. But let's talk about another use of photographs in research, and that is photo elicitation. And traditionally, it refers to interviewing with photographs, and this came from Collier's study out in the Maritimes, where he was interviewing people working in industrial plants, and he wanted to understand the transition, and he would show pictures of farmland from which many of the people had come from, and had these interviews. And what he found early on in the interviews, just talking to people, the interviewees became sort of restless, but when he showed the photographs, the whole nature of the interview process changed. Samantha Warren says that this type of interviewing with photographs is sort of like market researchers using flashcards of brands or packaging details to gauge customer responses. It is sort of trying to elicit what does this picture mean to you? It's eliciting responses in an interview between the researcher and the interviewee provoked by photographs. Now, first type is where the researcher has taken a picture and asked questions of the participant related to the photograph. Now, there's some advantages and disadvantages to this process. I'm going to touch on a few here, and I'm going to get some back and forth in a few minutes. The advantages of this, so if I go out and I take a picture and I want to know what a participant, an organizational participant, may think about it related to a research question, one of the advantages of that is I'm taking a picture that's connected to my research question. And it also can, again, having the photograph can help reduce what we call the white coat effect, reduce the power distance between the person doing the interview and the interviewee. When you're focusing on a photograph, you can reduce the overall power distance and hopefully deepen the interview and the willingness of the participant to share deeper meaning. The disadvantage is sometimes you just don't know what photograph to choose. Susan asked a question. I saw it up here. My experience in field research has literally involved going into the field. Can you say a bit more about what constitutes a field experiment? Well, I'm not really talking about a field experiment here. I'm really talking about more interviews. There is a whole cadre of field experiments, and I can think of maybe one or two in which they've used photographs, but I have to do a little bit of thinking and digging, but interesting question. So I'm getting back to the slide here is using photographs that I've taken as a researcher and interviewing someone. We're sitting across the table from each other and we're looking at photographs I've taken of their organizational setting, perhaps to capture their culture. And the problem with this is that the pictures may not be meaningful to them. It may be so mundane as not to be very interesting. So the researcher knowledge of the field setting may be limited and may end up creating photographs that aren't very meaningful. Also, there's always this worry that participants are going to be have self-representation bias. So you really have to think about the time in the field before you do the photograph. Do you understand the setting? Are you taking pictures that have relevance? What is the emotional reaction? And this is not to gloss over, because photographs are powerful. And when Collier was doing his research with the plant workers in the Maritime, showing them these agrarian pictures, many people broke down because they missed that life, and it became a very emotional experience. That is a consideration when you're going into the field. You also need to keep track of your decisions. Why did you take these pictures? Creating a diary, a chain of evidence, and a shooting script as well if there are multiple researchers, which means that you're telling researchers very clearly the types of photographs to take. But I failed with this method. I went into an organization and I wanted to understand why they have no turnover and they're doing sewing all day long. And I've been doing work with this, non-paid work with this organization for, I think, 7 years now. But this was one part of my research, and it failed. I took pictures of what I thought was interesting. Let me show you some of these pictures. Here's one of their lunchroom where they had pictures. Every employee had a picture on the wall that they could decorate, and it was organized by birthdays. I thought that was very unusual. I've never seen that before. Here's another aspect of this company. One of the reasons that I went into it is they danced every day at 3 o'clock when I first met them. And so this was a picture of their dance room, which I found quite peculiar. And here they were dancing, and then these were images, but they didn't see any specialness in the image. This was daily life to them. They just looked at the pictures and sort of laughed and couldn't really tell a story about them, or it was weird, and I just ended up not showing the pictures anymore and just talking to them. Now, I'll tell you a little bit more what happened to this study later, because there was a way to use photographs and use effectively. But the second type are participant photographs. So what would happen here is you tell a participant, go and take pictures of what it's like to work here, for instance. And they would take pictures and then you would interview them. What's the disadvantage of this way to capture photographs? What's the problem with this approach? What can be a problem? When you give the camera or you give the control to the participant to take pictures based on your research question. Tell me what it's like to work here. What's the culture like? What's the problem with that, or a disadvantage of this way to generate photographs? A couple people are typing. Yeah, get multiple particular, I'm not sure I can say that this time of the day. Multiple particular views. They select only what they want you to see. They may call out images that they don't want you to see. They're too sensitive. So some of the disadvantage of giving the power to the participant to take photographs is that you lose control, and you may get a lot of pictures that have nothing to do with what you're interested in. The participant also is never seen in the photographs, and that's a real hindrance as well. And they can selectively represent themselves. And there's also maybe a cost in reproducing some of the photographs. The advantage is you hear their voice, and you have the viewpoint from the organizational member. It also can reduce this power distance that I talked about earlier. But I would absolutely recommend pilot testing this on a few people in the organization and seeing what they come up with and seeing if your prompt makes any sense. And be clear about who owns the photographs on the front end. I think that's very important as well. So those are some considerations. This was the photograph. I taught a qualitative methodology course down in Tulane University, and I asked, they were from 4 different universities in Latin America, and I asked each member of the class, take a picture of the culture, take a picture of how do you think that your business school is its image in the community. And one of the participants, Luis, took this picture. I believe this is in Columbian Business School. And he said, listen, you see far in the distance the main university, but they situated us in this very impoverished area of the city because they wanted us to be a shining light and a way out, if you will. And had this really interesting story wrapped around this picture. And we did these in focus group style, meaning we had each student look from different universities look at the photographs, and then the person that took the photographs told the story. The interesting thing was that these people had been in class for at least a year together, and they said that this exercise allowed them to understand each other more than any other sort of activity they'd been involved in. They began to understand more about their background and their schools. This was another one from a freshman course. I asked, where do you find support? And this was it showed some pictures as well. I'm going to move forward kind of rapidly through some of these to get to the analysis, but another way to gather information, I found this really helpful, was to interview people, and they would tell me stories, and I'd be like, well, show me what you mean by that. And so I would go over and take pictures and have the participant with me, and I would take it of artifacts. I may take it of them demonstrating something, but I would actually be with the participant. They would be interviewing them, but I'd have my camera with me and take pictures of aspects that were interesting. So here were some of the pictures that I had taken. One of the organizational members said, you got to take a picture of that machine. It's really innovative. Again, most of these people were sewing, and this is a molding machine, and they're very proud that they could develop the skill set for the molding machine. Another one, a box of garments that have been used in a fashion show, and they, so I was in the shipping area interviewing the shipping clerk back there, and she said, what's this open box? Nothing's wrapped up in your packaging, and what's the deal with this box? And she told this rich story around how it had been used in a fashion show, so we couldn't sell it, but we were sending it down to a burn hospital. I believe it was in the Caribbean. They have that wrong, but it was a great story that captured an aspect of their giving back culture in this one artifact. This was another one. This was one of the workers' nephew who had been scalded by pulling a boiling pot of water, and they made compression garments, and they made a special order one for him, and he came in that day, again showing this real connection and this real caring for their people. I think I'd worked for a place that treated people and their extended family in this way. This is something else that's kind of interesting, is to stand in the same place when you're visiting a company over many years and to watch how it changes. This is what they call a dear photograph approach, where I put an old photograph in the back, and actually the new photograph is in the back, and the one that just entered was the old photograph, to show how they had removed the dancing room in order to bring in this other piece of equipment. So this was the old. This is the new. This was the old picture, and behind it was the new. You can capture strategic change that way and talk to people about change. That's the dear photograph approach. So there are a lot of benefits to photo elicitation. I think it reduces the power distance. You get a lot of rich data. The problem with photo elicitation research is then that the text and the interview data has only been analyzed, and it's been privileged. So that's a bit different. So I have a question from Susan about how do you analyze this stuff, and I wanted to show a couple of things really quickly, but I do think that photo elicitation can get to a deeper level. Just want to talk briefly. This is something else. Another way you can use photographs is I've used it with freshmen. I've been teaching them over many, many years, and I have them do a narrated PowerPoint or Pacha-Kacha, 20 slides, 20 photographs, 20 seconds per slide, and they narrate their transition to college, and I've been analyzing these pictures as well. I'm going to show you as well how I do that. So it's a great tool for the course, but I've been using it as a research project. I teach them as first semester freshmen, and then I interview them for every year. And then finally, I had this photo voice event where I over the years I collected all of these freshman experiences, and I created a photo voice event and invited administrators to see what it was like to step into the shoes of a first semester freshman. And that's another way in which you can use photo voice. A lot of people have used this. It was really one of the most important activities and events that I've been involved in my career. It was really amazing to see the provosts and such react to these photographs that were on the wall. And you'll see here a picture of how I had them displayed by the different themes. I had the photographs, and then I had the some of the moving quotes in here. It was a great event. It was a really a highlight of my career. And it was actually featured in the local paper because they found it really unusual. So those are uses of photographs in the field. How do you analyze data? There's a lot more work that we need to be doing here, but let me just show you briefly how you can analyze data. And there are two ways you can approach analyzing data. In fact, probably one of the approach them both ways. One is just, what do you see in the picture? What is there? Who is there? What's the nature of the space? And you can tag the objects in there. That's what we call manifest coding. But the latent meaning is probably going to come from the interviews. And so you want to be able to show how what they're talking about is connected to the objects. And if I can get my computer to cooperate, I'm going to show you how to actually hyperlink between the text and the image. But let me show you in a still slide. So this is a picture from the company that dances at 3 o'clock every day. And I have a code book, and I'm just going in and I'm making, you'll see a little square right here. I just make a square, and then I give it a code from a code book. And this can be done in any Cactus program, any software. So basically all I'm identifying here are some plants. Here is some artwork. Here's some signage. Here are a variety of things. And I'm just showing the manifest elements. But you also can bring in themes that came from the interviews. And so the plants were there, they were there, and they told a story about how people would bring their orchids that were about to die, and that this was an area where they'd be rejuvenated, which kind of connected with some materials and conversations inside the organization. Spirituality, instead of just books, these were books on spirituality that connected to some conversations there as well. This is done in any sort of Cactus program. You can see some of these squares in here. You're just creating a square and giving it a code tag. Let me see if I can give an example. Before I do that, because I just want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. In vivo, so I was using another one from Provalis Research, QDA Minor, really Atlas TI, all of them can do it. But in vivo handles videos extremely well. So I actually added, and here was part of the Pachacacha, and I could actually have the text right next to it, and I could tag the different segments right here with different codes, some of the different codes that I had. So you can do it in vivo as well. You're just tagging an aspect of the picture, the photograph, and linking it to the textual material to make sure that the meaning is there. Here's another slide and another piece of coding with that. Let me see if I have a really quick, I'm trying to think how I get out of this. Let's see, I'd like to end this, and I'm not sure how to actually do that. So let's see, here we go. I'm going to try to share a document, and it's going to browse my computer. And it's going to be had it in. Let's see, hold on a second. It's not it. Okay. Let's see. I can get there. Hold on one second. Just there. Shoot. You never find it when you need it. Let's see. I can't can't get it to work right. Should be showing it all right here. I think it's because it's not supported, because it's the software that I was going to use. I think that's not it. So I think right now we have a few minutes for some questions. I can hold on one second. Let me go back to my slides. But there are ways to use some of the things that I've talked about. Using photographs, I find one thing, if people really enjoy it and they have a good time, they're more engaged in the research project. Some people worry that maybe it's not rigorous or scientific enough, but it's a really great way to connect with participants. It shows interest in the organizational research setting. It's very easy to code them, as you saw. It's just basically the reason I can't start it up here is I'm using software doesn't seem to be supported, so I can't open the file. It's not recognizing that, but it's bridging and hyperlinking between the text and the other type of material. Let me see if there's one more thing that I can do on my own screen here. Maybe I can upload this really quickly. Okay. Okay. Let's see if I can share my screen. I'm going to get out of this screen. Way for me to get out of this screen. Okay. Let me see if I can share my screen. And do this. Okay. All right. Can you see this? Can you actually see this? I can't. Okay. Yeah. All right. Let me just show you really quickly what I've done here. So what I have set up here, so I can see what I'm doing. What I have here is I have three cases of 3 students, and these are their presentations with their 20 images. So you have images, all sorts of images over here. And I've already coded them for some things, books, caffeine. I have created a code book over here. So I've tagged them for both manifest as well as some mostly manifest aspects of what I'm seeing in the images. So what I have here is I have the presentation transcribed, but also have an interview. And so this was with, quote unquote, a student called Brianna. And what you can do in the text is I have over here, I coded this as artistic. You can see I've coded this as artistic. I've assigned it that code. But I've also created a hyperlink on here. And what you do with a hyperlink is if you control-click on it, it takes you to an image that I have identified as artistic. And I can go back and forth between the two. Let me show you one other thing, how easy it is to tag these and find an image that doesn't have too much. So let's see, all I do is just create a square around something. And I'm going to tag it with, I think I have one as caffeine. There we go. There's caffeine. Okay, so if I click on caffeine, it will highlight the area. And I can actually, I could write a comment if I want to write a comment here. Or I can hyperlink it back to some text, which is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to create a hyperlink. Okay, hit OK. And then I go back here to the interview. I'm going to try to find something about caffeine. Let's just say she's talking about caffeine right here. Let's pretend that's what she's talking about. And I right-click on it. And I hyperlink set as destination, and I want to create a link back to the source. That's all that I'm doing. I can also code this as caffeine as well. Okay. Actually, it's better if I did a hyperlink here. So on the code, or I can do it in the text. And I can go back here to the image, wherever I was. That is destination. All right. So I can go move between the image and the actual text. Okay, so I feel like I'm right at the end of my time. I have time for a few questions. I wanted to show you how the software, it's very easy to analyze, quote unquote, the textual, the text and linking it to the image. The coding is not really very difficult. The hard part is what is the story? And the story will come from both the text and the images. And given that a lot of our journals now are electronically delivered, I think there's real possibilities in the future for including more visual analysis and more visuals that have been analyzed in our text. So hopefully that helped you. So one question that Susan had, and again, I move pretty quickly between that. It's very, very simple. Any of the programs, Atlas TI, QDA Minor, which is a Provalis research project, or NVivo, they're very similar. The NVivo has a functionality to look at a stream of images. So instead of me having these set up as separate images like this, that you can look at all of them and it will move like a video, which these were actually videos. So, so that's how they compare. NVivo has some more functionality. And again, you can do the hyperlinking as well. It's a little bit more transparent than with QDA. I am a big believer in learning one Cactus program and not learning any more. So that's why I use this. And but in NVivo, I have learned to use it in terms of the videos. What guidelines do you use for your codebook generation? Codebook generation, again, there's no mystery to a code. I first look at what's manifest, what I see in the photographs, and I create a codebook based on what I'm seeing and group them into categories. And then I'm also reading the text at the same time, and I'm looking for what themes emerge from that as well. So that's sort of what's going on with that. So can you say a few words now about Glazer? I'm not sure what you want me to say about Glazer. I mean, I will say that he was on this ORM panel that was addressing can you analyze numeric data and then grounded theory, with a grounded theory methodology, the answer being yes. Now, the interesting thing about this series of paper, he had the last word, and he had some great words at the end of this paper in which there were a lot of different academics. He had some wonderful words about a grounded theory. There were some responses like Kevin Corley, Deborah Doherty, and Karen Lott, and then there was a response by two of the main leaders of the group. It's a really nice series of papers. I don't know his quantitative grounded theory book very well, but I'm not sure what else you wanted me to say about that. I'm not an expert in grounded theory, but it's, I guess I know enough to be dangerous. What other questions might you have? I know we're getting up to the final minutes here. The main thing is that we're at the tip of the iceberg in terms of including visual analysis in our data, and primarily we've looked at mostly textual data in terms of our qualitative analyses. So thank you. Yep, I'm 1 minute over. Thanks very much for being there, and I look forward to seeing you in Anaheim if you're there. Thank you, Karen, for organizing this. You're incredible. Thank you very much. Okay.